I picked out this story just for you. Let's listen to it.
Chapter 1. The Crimson Mirage. The Mega-Citadel of the Galaxy Council of Species was a testament to excess, a needle of iridescent glass and shimmering energy that pierced the perpetual twilight of its artificial sky. Within its upper echelons, where the air hummed with the quiet power of 1,000 treaties and backroom deals, lay the Crimson Mirage. It was less a bar and more a gilded cage, a sanctuary for the powerful to display their plumage before plucking each other bare. Holographic jellyfish pulsed with soft light in the air above tables carved from the heart of moons, while servers, their eyes augmented with data streams, drifted with silent precision, their trays laden with intoxicants from a dozen worlds. Commander Eva Rostova of the Imperial Coalition sat alone, her posture ramrod straight, a stark pillar of order amidst the fluid, opulent chaos. Her crisp, midnight blue uniform, adorned with the silver starburst of her command, was an island of disciplined reality. She ignored the synthale in her glass, the condensation tracing a cold path down its side. Her gaze was fixed on the viewport, where the city sprawled below, a tapestry of light and shadow. She was here on a diplomatic mission, a tedious affair of negotiating trade tariffs for the Coalition's agricultural worlds. It was a job that required patience, a virtue she possessed in abundance, but it was a patience worn thin by the posturing and doublespeak of the Council's lesser delegates. Her mind, sharp and analytical, ran through the day's conversations, cataloging every inflection, every micro-expression, every veiled threat. Her wits were her primary weapon, and here, they were never sheathed. The ambient murmur of the mirage shifted, a subtle change in pressure that preceded an arrival. Rostova didn't need to look. She felt it in the sudden, charged silence that fell over nearby tables. It was like the moment before a lightning strike, the air crackling with unspent energy. She turned her head slowly, her eyes, the color of a winter sky, meeting the newcomers. He moved through the crowd not like a man parting a sea, but like a shark through water, unseen until it was too late. He was Kray, a Xeno-Hunter of the Shadow Network, though that affiliation was not something one could read in his posture or his attire. He wore simple, dark synth leather, practical and unadorned, save for the twin disruptor pistols holstered at his hips. His face was a roadmap of old scars, one bisecting an eyebrow and disappearing into his hairline, another pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent, cynical half-smile. But it was his eyes that held the room's attention. They were an unnerving, luminous green, the color of toxic waste, and they didn't seem to look at people so much as through them, assessing, calculating, dismissing. His luck was almost legendary in the shadowy corridors of the network, a seemingly supernatural ability to walk away from situations that should have been vaporized him. Their paths had crossed before. In the wreckage of a derelict cruiser on the edge of Syndicate space, during a botched data exchange that had devolved into a three-way firefight. Rostova had been retrieving an Imperial asset. Kray had been collecting. They had not spoken, but their actions had been a silent, lethal dance. She had outmaneuvered his Syndicate allies with tactical precision. He had survived her point-blank plasma burst by the sheer fortune of a failing conduit exploding at the exact right moment. A mutual, unspoken respect was born from that encounter, the kind that exists only between predators who recognize an equal in the wild. Kray approached her table, his movements fluid and utterly silent. He didn't ask to sit. He simply pulled out the chair opposite her, the scrape of its legs against the polished floor the only sound he made. The nearby patrons, a collection of minor diplomats and corporate liaisons, suddenly found their drinks fascinating. "Commander," he said, his voice a low gravelly rasp, like stone grinding against stone. "Still saving the galaxy, one tariff negotiation at a time?" Rostova's expression remained unchanged, though a flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, or recognition, crossed her eyes. "Kray," she replied, her tone clipped and cool. "I'm surprised the network lets one of their hounds run loose in a place with so many rules. Doesn't it chafe?" Kray's half-smile widened, revealing a hint of teeth. "Rules are just suggestions, Commander. And I'm not here for the network. I'm here on a private matter. He gestured to her glass. Still nursing that? I'd have thought the imperial starch would have dissolved by now. I prefer clarity to intoxication, Rostova countered, her gaze unwavering. What do you want, Kray? I don't have time for your particular brand of chaos. I think you do, he said, leaning forward slightly. The movement was subtle, but it changed the dynamic entirely. He lowered his voice, a confidential tone that was more menacing than a shout. There's a data shard. Not just any data. The Starmap Ledger. The original. It contains every unregistered jump route, every black market outpost, every secret base the major powers have tried to erase from history for the last 200 years. The Syndicate, the Coalition, even your dear Council, they'd all kill to get their hands on it. Or, more accurately, they'd kill to make sure it stays buried. Rostova remained silent, but her mind was racing. The Starmap Ledger was a myth, a ghost story told by intelligence agents and smugglers in back alley bars. To possess it would be to hold the galaxy's secrets by the throat. It was the ultimate tool of power and the ultimate liability. Why are you telling me this? She finally asked, her voice low. Because it's here. In the Mega-Citadel. And it's about to change hands. An information broker named Fex is making the sell in the lower levels, in the Data Slicer's Bazaar. The buyer is a high-ranking ascending cultist. Imagine that, Commander. A zealous psionic with a bioengineered army and a map to every secret place in the galaxy. Does that sound like a future you want to live in? Rostova's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her glass. The ascending cult's fanaticism was a threat to the Coalition's stability, a cancer that needed to be cut out, not given the keys to the galaxy. And you want me to what? Retrieve it for you? I want to stop the transfer, Kray corrected. My client wants the ledger destroyed. Your Coalition wants it secured. The cult wants it for their holy war. 3 different objectives. But the first step is the same for all of us. Stop Fex and the cultist. We have a window of maybe 6 hours before the meet. You have the authority, the resources of your command to lock this place down. I have the local knowledge to find them before they disappear into the underbelly. A temporary alliance, Commander. For the greater good. Whatever we decide to do with it after, we can argue about then. Rostova stared at him, her analytical mind weighing the possibilities. Kray was a viper, but he was a viper she could see. The Ascendant cult was a nest of vipers, hidden and zealous. The threat, he described, was real. Allowing them to acquire the ledger was unacceptable. But trusting a shadow network operative, that was a gamble of the highest order. Just as she was about to formulate a refusal, a new player entered the game. A man in a perfectly tailored, charcoal gray suit detached himself from the bar and moved towards their table with an unhurried, confident stride. He was Vex, a broker, another agent of the Shadow Network, though one who operated on an entirely different level from Kray. Where Kray was the blunt instrument of force and fortune, Vex was the scalpel of information and manipulation. His face was bland and unremarkable, the kind you would instantly forget, and he carried himself with an air of bureaucratic mundanity that was a more effective disguise than any mask. Vex stopped beside their table, placing a slim data slate upon it with a soft click. He didn't look at Kray, his attention fixed solely on Rostova. Commander Rostova, he said, his voice smooth as polished chrome. A pleasure. I represent an interested third party. One who believes that such a volatile artifact as the Starmap Ledger is best left in neutral hands. Or, better yet, erased from existence entirely. He slid the slate an inch towards her. This contains the precise location of the exchange. A Level 7 subgrid processing station. It also contains the access codes for the security lockdown in that sector. You can walk in there with an entire battalion, or you can lock them in and vent the atmosphere. The choice is yours. He finally glanced at Kray, a flicker of cold amusement in his eyes. Kray, your client's interests have been noted and overruled. The network prefers a more permanent solution to this problem. One that doesn't involve a messy shootout or a protracted custody battle over a very dangerous toy. Kray's green eyes narrowed, the air around him seeming to grow colder. He didn't move, but Rostova could feel the coiled tension in his frame.
Vex.
You always did prefer poisoning the well to fetching the water. The water is poison, my friend, Vex replied smoothly, already backing away. You just haven't tasted it yet. Commander, the slate is yours. The decision, as they say, is yours. Don't take too long. Opportunities like this are fleeting. He turned and melted back into the crowd, disappearing as completely as if he had never been there. Rostova looked from the data slate to Kray's grim face. The game had just changed. Vex had offered her a clean, simple, brutal solution. It was efficient.
It was the Imperial way.
Eliminate the threat, eliminate the artifact, eliminate the problem. But Kray's presence, his very existence in this equation, complicated it. Why would the network send two agents with conflicting agendas? Unless Vex was operating on his own authority, a possibility that was even more troubling. She looked at the slate, then back at Kray. The ledger, Kray, she said, her voice firm and decisive. You and I are going to get it. Then we'll decide its fate. Vex's plan is not an option. A slow, predatory grin spread across Kray's face. I was hoping you'd say that, Commander. He stood up. Let's go crash a party. Chapter 2. Descent into the grid. The transition from the gilded heights of the Mega-Citadel to its lower levels was like passing through the gates of hell. The pristine, silent lifts that served the elite gave way to grimy, public-access turbolifts that shook with the strain of their own mechanisms. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone, recycled waste, and a dozen different alien pheromones. The wide, clean corridors became a labyrinth of cramped tunnels and makeshift walkways, strung with flickering neon signs advertising everything from black market cybernetics to synthetic stimulants. This was the city's digestive tract, a place where the glittering promises of the upper levels were broken down into their base, brutal components. Rostova moved with a grim efficiency, her hand never far from the holstered pulse pistol at her side. Her training had prepared her for combat zones and hostile boardings, but this was a different kind of war. It was a war of attrition against decay, a battle of wits against an environment designed to confuse and overwhelm. Every shadow held a potential threat, every intersection a potential ambush. Her wits were her shield, her mind constantly mapping their route, identifying choke points, and assessing the demeanor of the various denizens they passed. Glowering cyborgs from the free frontier, haggling traitors from the syndicate, and hunched-over figures whose allegiance was written in the circuitry grafted to their skin. Kray, by contrast, was in his element. He navigated the chaos with an easy, almost casual grace. He didn't scan for threats. He seemed to absorb the ambient data of the street, his head turning slightly at the sound of a distant argument, his green eyes flickering to a new piece of gang graffiti sprayed on a wall. He was a predator who knew his hunting ground intimately. He led her down an alley that smelled of rust and damp concrete, stopping before a seemingly dead end. Vex Slate is a good starting point, but it's also a leash, Kray said, his voice low. He's assuming you'll take the most direct route. That's where his surprises will be waiting. He ran his fingers along a seam in the wall, pressing on a discolored panel. A section of the concrete groaned and slid inward, revealing a dark, narrow service corridor. The network built these places. They know all the shortcuts. Rostova eyed the dark opening with suspicion. How do I know this isn't your ambush? You don't, Kray replied without a shred of irony. But if I wanted you dead, you would have been poisoned back in the Mirage. It's cleaner. Vex prefers Messier more instructive ends. Now, are you coming? Without waiting for a reply, he slipped into the darkness. Rostova hesitated for a fraction of a second, her tactical mind screaming against entering a confined, unknown space with an operative she couldn't trust. But the logic of his words held. Vex had given her the information too easily. It was bait. With a barely audible sigh of resignation, she drew her pistol and followed him inside. The service corridor was a claustrophobic tunnel of humming power conduits and snaking data cables. The air was stale and warm. Kray moved with confidence, his steps sure on the grid floor. Vex, the broker, is a coward, he said over his shoulder. He'll have backup. Professional. Likely ex-military, maybe from your coalition or the frontier. They'll be guarding the perimeter of the subgrid station. The real problem is the cultist. They travel with an honor guard of Necro-Spliced abominations. Not much for tactics, but they feel no pain and don't stop until their central nervous system is pulp. Spare me the bedtime stories, Kray, Rostova replied, her voice tight. Just get me to the target. They emerged from the tunnels into a cavernous space, the ceiling lost in a haze of smoke and flickering light. This was the Data Slicer's Bazaar, a black market for information. Stalls were crammed together, their owners hawking stolen corporate data, cracked security codes, and illicit neural programs. The air buzzed with the low thrum of 100 overclocked processors. It was here, in this den of digital thieves, that Vex had laid his first trap. They had barely taken a dozen steps into the throng when Kray suddenly grabbed Rostova's arm, yanking her behind a stall piled high with scavenged droid parts. Down, he hissed. A moment later, the chaos began. Not with a bang, but with a click. A series of high-pitched, sonic clicks emanated from several points around the bazaar. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. People screamed, clutching their heads as the sonic frequency disrupted their auditory and vestibular systems. Some collapsed, writhing in vertigo. Others staggered about blindly, crashing into stalls. Psi-sonic emitters, Rostova grunted, her teeth clenched against the disorienting waves. Her coalition training included countermeasures for this kind of crowd control. She activated a small device on her wrist, and a low-frequency hum countered the assault, the world stabilizing around her. She looked up to see Kray on one knee, shaking his head, a trickle of blood running from his nose. His luck had not protected him from this. A group of 4 figures moved through the panicked crowd with purposeful strides. They were clad in matte black armor, their faces hidden behind featureless helmets. They moved with military precision, cutting down anyone who got in their way with brutal efficiency using stun batons and neural maces. They were Vex's cleanup crew, sent to eliminate the competition before the main event. Rostova didn't hesitate. She rose from behind the stall, her pulse pistol already in her hand. She fired 3 shots, the blue bolts of plasma punching through the chest plate of the lead attacker. He went down without a sound. The other 3 turned towards her, their assault immediate and coordinated. One charged, swinging a stun baton in a wide arc. Rostova sidestepped, using his momentum to hurl him into a stack of glowing data crystals, which exploded in a shower of sparks. Another fired a neural mace, a projectile that would incapacitate on impact. Rostova twisted, the sphere slamming into the wall behind her and releasing a wave of paralytic energy. She returned fire, catching the second attacker in the shoulder. The third was smarter, using the panicked crowd as cover. Rostova lost sight of him for a second, and that was all he needed. A blade, gleaming with a faint neurotoxin, sliced towards her throat from the side. She brought her pistol up to block, but she knew she wouldn't be fast enough. Then Kray was there. He had shaken off the effects of the emitter, his green eyes burning with a feral intensity. He didn't use a weapon. He moved inside the attacker's guard, grabbing the arm with a knife and twisting with impossible speed. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the attacker screamed as Kray wrenched the blade from his grasp and plunged it into the side of his neck. Kray didn't even watch him fall, his gaze already scanning for more threats. Vex is getting impatient, Kray growled, wiping the blood from his nose with the back of his hand. He just made this personal, Rostova replied, her expression cold as ice. She kicked the fallen attacker's weapon away. The subgrid station.
Now.
The path was now clear, the panicked parting before them like the Red Sea. They moved quickly, their alliance forged not in trust, but in the shared crucible of Vex's ambush. The station was a brutalist block of ferrocrete, its entrance a heavily reinforced blast door, currently guarded by 2 more of Vex's black-armored soldiers. They stood like statues, their pulse rifles aimed at the door. "I'll take the one on the left," Kray said, a manic gleam in his eyes. "Try to keep up." Before Rostova could respond, he moved. It wasn't a charge or a tactical advance. It was a blur of motion. He sprinted directly at the guards, not using cover, not attempting stealth. The guards opened fire, plasma bolts sizzling through the air where he had been a moment before. He was impossibly fast, his luck a palpable shield that deflected probability itself. A bolt scorched the wall beside his head. Another vaporized a piece of floor at his feet. He reached them in a heartbeat, a whirlwind of controlled violence. He disarmed the first guard, spun him around, and used him as a human shield against the second's fire. As the second guard hesitated, Kray threw a wickedly sharp combat knife, catching him in the throat. Rostova, meanwhile, had taken a more measured approach. She used the distraction Kray had created to circle around, coming up behind the remaining guard who was struggling with Kray's former shield. She fired a single, perfectly aimed shot, disabling the rifle in his hands. Kray finished him with a brutal elbow strike to the temple. He stood over the fallen guards, breathing heavily, a predator's grin on his face. Rostova walked up to the blast door, accessing the control panel. She pulled out Vex's slate, interfacing it with the system. Vex gave you the codes. He wants you to go in, Rostova stated, her fingers flying across the panel. He wants us to go in a specific way, Kray corrected, looking at the schematic that appeared on the slate screen. The primary ventilation system. That's the trap. He probably has it rigged to flood with incinerator gas the moment we're inside. Rostova's eyes scanned the schematic. Her wits, honed by years of tactical analysis, saw the flaw instantly. There was a secondary maintenance access, a much smaller, unmarked conduit that led directly to the main processing core. It was a tight fit, but it bypassed the main chamber and Vex's trap entirely. He's clever, she admitted, a grudging respect in her voice. But he's predictable. She rerouted the power, overriding the lock on the maintenance hatch. It hissed open, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel. After you, Kray. Your luck might be more useful in a tight space. Kray's laugh was a short, sharp bark. Don't worry, Commander. I'll make sure there's room for both of us. He crawled into the darkness, and Rostova followed, her mind already calculating the variables of the confrontation to come. Chapter 3. The Sanctum of Secrets. The maintenance conduit was a claustrophobic nightmare of raw circuitry and bundled fiber optics. It was a space designed for droids, not people, and Rostova had to contort her body to navigate its twisting path. Kray moved ahead of her, his form a dark silhouette against the faint glow of the data lines. They moved in silence, the only sound the distant hum of the station's massive processors and the soft scuff of their own movements. Rostova's mind was a tactical command center, running through every possible scenario. Vex, the broker, would be nervous. He would want the exchange to happen quickly and cleanly. The ascendant cultist would be zealous and dismissive of any mundane security. They would be overconfident. And Vex would be watching, waiting for his moment to trigger whatever trap he had laid. They reached a junction box, and Kray stopped, his hand held up for silence. He pointed to a small grill in the wall. Rostova moved up beside him, peering through the slats. They were looking down into the main processing core of the subgrid station. It was a cavernous, circular chamber, dominated by a massive central pillar pulsing with a cold blue light. Banks of servers lined the walls, their status lights blinking in a hypnotic rhythm. The air shimmered with the heat displacement of the powerful machines. In the center of the room, 3 figures stood around a small, metallic table. The first was Vex. He was a rodent-like alien, twitchy and nervous, his large eyes darting around the room. He wore a heavy armored coat, but it did little to hide his perpetual state of anxiety. He was the classic information broker, a middleman, a necessary evil, destined to be consumed by one side or the other. The second figure was a nightmare made flesh. It was a Necro-Splicer, an acolyte of the ascendant cult. Its body was a grotesque patchwork of pale, sutured flesh and gleaming cybernetics. One arm was a mass of writhing, bioengineered tentacles, while its head was encased in a chrome dome, wires plugged directly into its brain. It stood perfectly still, a monument to the cult's perversion of nature and technology. The third was the cultist buyer. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in flowing robes of crimson and black. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a fanatical fire. He was a Techno-Shaman, a leader within the Ascendant hierarchy, his psionic power palpable even at a distance. On the table between them lay a small, crystalline shard, the Starmap Ledger. It glowed with a soft, internal light, as if holding the captured starlight of 1,000 secret systems. "The exchange is happening," Rostova whispered, her voice barely audible. "And Vex isn't here," Kray murmured back, his green eyes scanning the shadows. "That's what's bothering me." As if on cue, a voice echoed through the chamber. It was Vex, his smooth, bureaucratic tone dripping with condescending authority. It came from the station's public address system. "Gentlemen and other things," Vex began. "I'm afraid this transaction is concluded. The ledger is now property of the Shadow Network. Thank you for your cooperation." The Techno-Shaman looked up, his expression not of surprise, but of righteous fury. "You dare interfere with the will of the Ascendant. You are nothing, a shadow in the light of our destiny." "Destiny is a narrative written by the victor," Vex replied coolly. "And I am a very good editor. Vex, I suggest you leave now. Your part in this is over." Vex, the broker, didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled for the exit, his desperation comical in its intensity. That was the signal. The Techno-Shaman raised his hands, and a wave of psionic energy, visible as a distortion in the air, slammed outwards. The lights in the chamber flickered and died, plunging the room into emergency red lighting. Alarms began to blare. "He's locked us in," Rostova said, her voice tight. "Vex trap. He's going to vent the atmosphere." "Not yet," Kray grunted, already prying open the maintenance hatch. "He wants to see who wins first." They dropped down into the chamber, landing silently behind a bank of servers. The Techno-Shaman was focused on the door, his psionic power trying to force it open, while the Necro-Splicer turned, its chrome dome swiveling as its internal sensors sought the new threat. "Vex is getting away," Rostova stated, her pistol aimed at the retreating broker. "He has the access codes." "Forget Vex," Kray snapped, drawing his twin disruptor pistols. "Vex wants the ledger. The shaman wants the ledger. The ledger is the only thing that matters. You take the abomination. I'll handle the zealot." It was a reckless plan, but there was no time for debate. The Necro-Splicer had locked onto them. It moved with a horrifying, jerky speed, its tentacle arm lashing out like a whip. Rostova rolled to the side, the whip-like appendage cracking against the server bank where she had been standing, showering the area in sparks. She came up firing, her plasma bolts hammering into the creature's torso. The shots hit, but they had little effect. The creature's bioengineered flesh and cybernetic enhancements absorbed the damage, its advance relentless. It was a terrifying foe, feeling no pain, driven by some arcane programming. Rostova switched tactics. She couldn't overpower it, so she would outthink it. She used her wits to analyze its movements, its patterns. It relied on its tentacle arm for offense, its other limbs for locomotion. It was fast in a straight line, but it seemed to have trouble changing direction quickly. She began to circle, staying just outside its reach, her shots now aimed at the joints, at the connections between flesh and metal. Meanwhile, Kray engaged the Techno-Shaman. The zealot was a whirlwind of psionic energy. He hurled bolts of force with his hands, telekinetically wrenched pieces of machinery from the walls and hurled them at Kray, who dodged and weaved with a preternatural grace that defied belief. A conduit ripped free from the ceiling and flew towards Kray's head. He ducked under it by a hair's breadth. A server bank toppled over. He leapt over it as it crashed to the floor. Kray was a blur of motion, his disruptors barking. The energy bolts from his pistols were designed to overload systems, not just burn flesh. He wasn't trying to kill the shaman, he was trying to disrupt his psionic focus. He fired at the shaman's feet, at the floor around him, forcing him to divert his attention from offense to defense. It was a dangerous, high-stakes duel of luck versus psionic power. Rostova saw her opening. The Necro-Splicer overextended, lunging with its tentacle arm. Instead of dodging, Rostova ducked under the attack, lunging forward and jamming the barrel of her pistol directly into a cluster of exposed wires on the creature's chest. She fired. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The feedback from the plasma bolt overloaded the creature's systems. Lights flashed across its chrome dome, and its body spasmed violently. It let out a guttural, electronic scream as it collapsed, smoke pouring from its seams. Rostova didn't waste a second. She turned her attention to the other fight. Kray was holding his own, but the shaman was powerful. He had Kray pinned behind a console, a constant barrage of telekinetic debris keeping him suppressed. Rostova aimed, not at the shaman but at the central processing pillar. She fired a single, precise shot at a critical power conduit. The shot hit its mark. The pillar sputtered, and the entire chamber was plunged into absolute darkness, the emergency lights failing as well. The psionic assault stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of the alarms and the hum of failing machinery. In the pitch black, Rostova moved with purpose. She knew the layout of the room from the schematic. She moved to the table where the ledger lay. Her hand closed around the cool, smooth crystal. A voice cut through the darkness. It was Vex, his calm now replaced by a cold fury. "Vent the atmosphere. Now." The vents in the ceiling slammed open. But instead of air, a thick, green gas began to pour into the room. It was incinerator gas, fast-acting and lethal. Rostova felt her lungs begin to burn immediately. She had seconds. "Kray!" She yelled into the darkness. A hand grabbed her arm, pulling her towards the wall. "This way." Kray's voice was strained. He had found the maintenance hatch in the dark. They scrambled inside, pulling the hatch closed just as the gas filled the chamber. They collapsed in the conduit, gasping for air in the relative safety of the tunnel. The Starmap Ledger was clutched in Rostova's hand. "We have it," she panted. "For now," Kray replied, his voice grim. "Vex isn't done. And we're trapped in here." Chapter 4. The Zero-G Gambit. They were trapped, but they were alive. The incinerator gas was a deadly, corrosive agent that would eat through the station's hull in minutes, but it wouldn't penetrate the reinforced maintenance conduits. Their immediate problem was not the gas, but the man who had released it. "He's locked us in," Rostova said, her mind racing. "He's venting the atmosphere to kill us, but he's also sealed the station. He's coming for the ledger himself." "Of course he is," Kray grunted, checking the power cell on one of his disruptors. "Vex doesn't delegate. He prefers to personally oversee his victories." They were in a race against time. The gas would soon compromise the structural integrity of the entire subgrid level. Their only escape route was through the station's primary systems, which meant navigating a labyrinth of conduits, shafts, and maintenance tunnels, all while Vex hunted them. Rostova's Wits were their only map. She pulled out her datapad, interfacing with the station's schematics she had downloaded earlier. There's a primary utility shaft that runs the length of the station. It connects to the main cargo bay. If we can get there, we can access the emergency escape pods. "And Vex will know that," Kray countered. "He'll have the route covered." "Not the whole route," Rostova said, her eyes tracing the glowing lines on the schematic. "There's a secondary junction. A zero-G maintenance tunnel that runs along the outer hull. It's not on the primary schematics. It's a failsafe for extreme emergencies. Vex probably doesn't even know it exists." Kray's green eyes lit up with a predatory gleam. "A zero-G fight. My favorite." He looked at Rostova. "You're not bad in a tight spot for a coalition stiff. And you're not completely useless for a shadow-dwelling rogue," Rostova replied, a faint hint of a smile touching her lips. The alliance had solidified in the crucible of the firefight. It wasn't trust, but it was a grudging respect, and in their line of work that was almost as good. They moved through the conduits, a tense silence between them. The sounds of the station's death throes echoed around them, the groan of stressed metal, the hiss of escaping gas, the intermittent crackle of failing power. Rostova led, her datapad guiding them through the maze. They reached the access panel for the zero-G tunnel. It was unmarked and rusted shut. "Allow me," Kray said, producing a small, explosive charge from a pouch on his belt. He placed it on the hinges. "Stand back." The explosion was small and contained, blowing the lock and sending the hatch spinning into the void beyond. The tunnel was a narrow, cylindrical shaft, the blackness of space visible at the far end. Magnetic rungs lined the walls. They pushed off, entering the zero-G environment. The transition was disorienting. Rostova, trained for ship-to-ship combat in zero-G, adapted quickly, using the rungs to control her momentum. Kray moved with an unnerving naturalness, as if born to weightlessness.
They were halfway down the tunnel when the attack came.
It wasn't an ambush with weapons. It was an ambush of technology. The magnetic rungs they were holding suddenly deactivated. The lights in the tunnel went out, plunging them into complete darkness, save for the distant stars. And then a new sound, the whine of high-powered servos. A maintenance drone, its single red eye glowing like a malevolent star, detached itself from the wall of the tunnel. It was a heavy-duty repair unit, but Vex had clearly repurposed it. It was armed with a plasma cutter and a heavy-duty grappling claw. It was Vex Proxy, his remote-controlled weapon in the void. The drone lunged, its grappling claw snapping open and shut. Rostova kicked off the wall, propelling herself sideways as the claw smashed into the rung where her hand had been a moment before. "It's controlled from the main server room," Kray yelled, his voice echoing in the confined space. "If we can get back there, we can shut it down." "No time," Rostova shouted back, pulling herself along the wall of the tunnel, using the slight friction of her boots to propel herself. "We have to disable it here." The drone was on them again, its plasma cutter flaring to life, a brilliant blue blade of energy that sliced through the darkness. Rostova pushed off towards the drone, a reckless, impossible maneuver. As the plasma cutter swung towards her, she fired her pistol, not at the drone, but at the wall behind it. The plasma bolt exploded against the metal hull, creating a blinding flash and a shower of sparks. The drone's optical sensor, overwhelmed by the sudden flash of light, momentarily froze. That was the opening Kray needed. He launched himself from the opposite wall, his body coiling like a spring. He flew through the space between them, his disruptor pistol held before him like a ram. He didn't fire. He slammed the heavy weapon directly into the drone's red optical sensor. There was a crunch of glass and metal. The drone spasmed violently, its plasma cutter sputtering and dying. It spun out of control, smashing into the wall of the tunnel before careening off into the blackness of space. "Nice," Rostova admitted, pulling herself towards him. "Now, let's get out of here." They reached the end of the tunnel, emerging into the main cargo bay. It was a cavernous, empty space, the escape pods visible on the far wall. But standing between them and their escape was Vex. He was no longer the bland, bureaucratic figure from the bar. He was clad in a suit of light, tactical armor, a sleek pulse rifle in his hands. He looked calm, composed, and utterly lethal. "Commander Rostova." "Kray," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. "An impressive performance. You've exceeded my expectations. But the game is over. Hand over the ledger." "You should have stayed in the shadows, Vex," Kray snarled, raising his disruptors. "Shadow work is for minions," Vex replied, aiming his rifle. "I am a broker of outcomes. And this outcome is inevitable." The final battle was not a prolonged firefight. It was a sudden, brutal eruption of violence. Vex was a professional, his movements economical and precise. He fired first, a 3-round burst aimed at Kray's chest. But Kray's luck was a tangible thing. He had already begun to move, a preternatural instinct telling him to dive to the side. The plasma bolts sizzled through the space he had just occupied, slamming into the wall behind him. Rostova moved in the opposite direction, her own pistol coming up. She fired, forcing Vex to take cover behind a stack of cargo containers. It was a classic pincer movement, executed without a word. Vex was good, but he was 2 against 1. He tried to suppress Rostova, but Kray was already moving, flanking his position. Vex saw the movement, swung his rifle around to engage Kray, and that was his mistake. He left his back exposed to Rostova for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She didn't aim for a kill shot. She aimed for his rifle. Her plasma bolt struck the weapon's power pack. The rifle exploded in Vex's hands, throwing him backward with the force of the blast. He screamed, clutching his ruined arm and face. Rostova and Kray were on him in an instant. Kray pressed the barrel of his disruptor to Vex's head. "Any last words, broker?" Vex, his face blackened and bleeding, looked up at them, his eyes burning with hatred. "The network will not forget this." "We're counting on it," Rostova said, her voice cold. She took the Starmap Ledger from her pouch. Now, about her escape. They dragged Vex with them to the escape pods, using him as a living key to bypass the final launch authorization. They sealed him in one pod, launching it on a timer that would send it drifting for a few hours before the Citadel's patrol picked it up. A humiliating, but survivable, end to his ambitions. Rostova and Kray entered the last pod. As the launch sequence initiated, they sat in silence, the adrenaline slowly fading. The pod shot out of the cargo bay into the endless night of space. Behind them, the subgrid station was a dying ember, its lights flickering out one by one. Rostova looked at the crystalline shard in her hand. The Starmap Ledger. It held the fate of worlds, the power to topple empires and create new ones. She looked at Kray, who was cleaning his disruptor with an almost ritualistic focus. "What now, Kray?" she asked. "Your client wanted it destroyed. My coalition wants it secured. We have it." Kray looked up, his green eyes meeting hers. The manic energy was gone, replaced by a calm, calculating intelligence. "We have a problem," he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "A very big, very valuable problem. I think our little temporary alliance just got a whole lot more interesting." Rostova looked from the ledger to Kray's face, and for the first time, she felt a thrill that had nothing to do with the danger they had just survived. She had the ledger. Kray was her unpredictable, dangerous partner. The galaxy was an open book, and they held the key to its most secret chapters. The future was a blank page, and they were about to start writing.